Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your front door will not open, your windows will not break, your phone has no signal, the internet is gone, and every family on your street is trapped inside their own home. That is the terrifying setup of The Last House, Louis Leterrier's new thriller, and what makes it work is not the science fiction mystery outside. It is the slow collapse of the family trapped inside. The story follows the Delgado family in Seattle. Jason, played by Wagner Moura, is an unemployed engineer trying to hold onto the idea that he can still protect everyone. His wife Anne, played by Greta, is more alert to the damage forming around them, both inside the house and inside the family. Their children, Graham and Ruth, are old enough to understand that something is terribly wrong, but still young enough to expect their parents to know what to do. During a violent November storm, the family realizes they cannot leave the house. The doors refuse to open. The windows are somehow sealed. Even attempts to smash the glass fail. At first, they assume the problem is somehow limited to them. Then they look outside. Every house on the street appears to be trapped in exactly the same way. That moment feels both impossible and strangely familiar. After the global lockdowns of 2020, we know what it is like when ordinary routines disappear overnight and no one knows when normal life will return. The Last House pushes that memory into nightmare territory. There is no government announcement, no emergency instructions, no visible military presence, and no clear enemy. Internet access disappears. Phone signals vanish. The Delgados have no idea whether their neighborhood is isolated, whether Seattle is affected, or whether the entire world has been placed under the same strange confinement. At first, the community reacts with surprising optimism. Neighbors communicate through handwritten signs. Food is shared carefully. Families establish routines. The Delgados try to preserve normal life with movie nights and small rituals, then days become weeks. Christmas arrives, and the family begins to understand that this may not be temporary. That is when the movie stops being a mystery thriller and becomes something much more uncomfortable. Jason and Anne are forced to make decisions that parents are never supposed to make. How much food do they save? How honest should they be with the children? When does kindness become dangerous? At what point does survival require doing something that would have seemed unthinkable only weeks earlier? Those questions are far more compelling than the eventual explanation for the confinement. The science fiction side of the movie is intentionally vague for a long time. Strange changes begin appearing outside. The house itself shows structural damage. Glimpses through windows suggest that something much larger is happening to the environment. Eventually, the film reveals a broader ecological transformation, pushing The Last House toward climate science fiction. But the family is what makes the film effective. Wagner Moura gives Jason the exhausted energy of a man desperately trying to remain useful. He is an engineer, so his instinct is to solve problems. If something breaks, he fixes it. If supplies disappear, he invents another system. Jason begins modifying the house in almost MacGyver-like ways, turning an ordinary suburban home into a structure designed to keep for people alive indefinitely. But the more he changes the house, the more obvious it becomes that he cannot fix the real problem. He cannot tell his children when they will leave. He cannot promise and that things will return to normal. He cannot control what is happening outside. Greta performance becomes crucial because Anne represents a different kind of survival instinct. Jason wants solutions and wants honesty. She notices the cracks before he does, both literally and emotionally. That tension gives the film its strongest scenes. The parents are not fighting because one of them is right and the other is wrong. They are fighting because both approaches become necessary. Graham and Ruth are also unusually well written for children in a survival movie. They adapt, become more independent, and are forced to grow up inside a single building without school, friends, teachers, or any larger social world. That idea is quietly horrifying. Children usually develop by moving outward. Their world becomes larger. In The Last House, the opposite happens. Their entire universe shrinks to a few rooms. The Delgado home also changes with them. It begins as a spacious mid-century house and slowly becomes a survival machine as rooms are repurposed and damage spreads. The house becomes a visual timeline of the family's psychological state. Director Leterrier is better known for large-scale filmmaking, from The Incredible Hulk to Fast X. But here he spends much of the movie working inside a confined environment. When Leterrier focuses on what cannot be seen, the tension works a sound outside the wall, a shadow moving beyond the glass, something changing in the street. Those moments are more effective than the larger visual effects sequences later in the film, and that becomes one of the movie's weaknesses. Once the last house begins explaining itself, some of the mystery disappears. The environmental ideas become more explicit, the digital effects become larger, and the movie occasionally loses the claustrophobic realism that made the first half so strong. There are also interesting themes about community. At the beginning, the neighbors help each other. They share information. They cooperate, but scarcity changes relationships. Generosity becomes calculation. Trust becomes suspicion. Eventually, everyone has to decide where responsibility to the community ends and responsibility to family begins. Crisis can bring people together, but prolonged crisis also reveals the limits of cooperation. The film does not completely succeed as deep environmental science fiction. Some of its larger ideas remain underdeveloped, but as a family survival drama, it is much stronger. That is why the story feels relevant without constantly reminding us of the pandemic. Anyone who lived through lockdown will recognize the endless waiting, the strange routines, the anxiety of not knowing when normal life will return, and the fear that children are losing something they may never recover. And the uncomfortable truth is that even when the world appears to stop, everyday life somehow continues. People still argue, kids still get bored, someone still has to cook, someone still has to clean. Christmas still arrives. That may be the most believable part of the entire movie. The Last House is ultimately not about the end of the world. It is about what happens after people realize the end may take much longer than expected. And that is much scarier. I want to know what you think about this premise. Would being trapped inside your own home feel safer than surviving outside? Or would the uncertainty eventually become worse than whatever is waiting beyond the walls? Because in The Last House, the biggest threat may not be what is keeping the family inside. It may be how long they can remain a family once there is nowhere else to go.